Hello everybody and welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. I am your host Megan Lewis and today I am going to be joined by Dr. Bart Ehrman. Dr. Ehrman is a New Testament and early Christianity specialist. If you've not come across him, he and I actually run a podcast together called Misquoting Jesus. You can find it on YouTube, all the other podcasty places, and he is very well known for doing an awful lot of public education work. And we're going to be talking today about the earliest Christian heresies. This is because he's going to be teaching a course called The Earliest Christian Heresies, an 8-lecture course covering the lost beliefs, rival gospels, and battles that shaped early Christianities. It will be a live recording on November 8th and 9th. That's this year, 2025. I'm going to be moderating it, so come along, see both of us all at the same time. And then afterwards, the lectures will be turned into an online course. So if you are watching this after November 8th and 9th, then you can watch it anytime you want. You can still have access to everything. I am doing this interview partly because I enjoy Bart, I enjoy talking with him, I enjoy the subject, but also I am an affiliate. So if you use the link that I have, I will have an affiliates link in the video description below if you are interested in joining us for these recordings or taking the classes after the recordings have happened. Because it is an affiliate link, I do get compensated for any people who use my particular link. So just in the interest of transparency, that's a thing that happens. But please enjoy this conversation between Bart and I. I enjoyed myself. I always enjoy hearing about what happened to Christianity before it became kind of homogeneous. Although thinking about it is not really homogeneous at all these days, is it? And probably never was, and definitely wasn't in the earliest times. So Bart's going to be explaining some of that to us. So, Bart, modern Christianity seems to largely self-identify as monotheistic. Is this also true for early Christian groups?
Well, it's true for some early Christian groups, but surprisingly not for all. And one of the really challenging groups to what became orthodoxy was a group headed by a guy named Marcion in the 2nd century, who strongly argued with pretty good logic that the God of the Old Testament was literally not the God of the New Testament, and that there were two gods, and that the God of Jesus is trying to save you from the wrathful God of the Old Testament. And then you start getting these Gnostic groups that have like 12 gods or 36 gods, and they all claim that they're following the teachings of Jesus, and they have writings by apostles to prove it. And so, it's monotheism became the view, and I think because I think the church fathers who ended up triumphing realized we have to have a connection to Judaism, because otherwise we're just kind of off by ourselves.
So worshipping different gods wasn't exactly controversial in the ancient world. If I'm in Mesopotamia and I worship Ishtar and my neighbor prefers Gula, we're not really going to come to blows over those differences. Were these different Christian groups similarly amicable in their differences?
No, not at all. Before Christianity came along, I mean, going as far back as we have historical records, and before historical records, whether you're in Mesopotamia or whether you're in Greece or wherever, the Roman Empire, wherever you are, religions were polytheistic. And part of being polytheistic religion was the recognition that there are other gods who deserve to be worshipped. And so if you worshiped one God, you're never compelled to worship another. And you never just worshiped one anyway, almost never. But with Christianity, when Christianity came along from the outset, the claim was we have the correct understanding of God, and Christ is his son. And if you don't believe in him, you will have eternal punishment. So Christianity is exclusive. You've got to be Christian. But then what happens is when Christianity starts developing in different directions, which kind of Christian do you have to be? And each group said, yeah, we're the right way, and the others are the wrong way. Oh, yeah.
Did the Proto-orthodox group, so the group that kind of came before what developed into mainstream Christianity, did they take particular issue with different denominations or different sects having all of these multiple deities?
Yeah, well, that was one of the many things they took issue with, but it's certainly that. And so we have what you and I are calling proto-orthodox, or the group of Christians, or the groups of Christians who basically subscribe to the views that eventually became dominant, that people think of Christianity today, where there's one God and Christ is his son, and Christ's death brought about salvation for the world, these kind of standard ideas. And starting in the 2nd century, so maybe, about 100 years after Paul, you start getting writings by some of these church fathers who are attacking other views by people claim to be Christian, who have apostolic books to back up their views, not just about 2 gods or 12 gods, but about all sorts of different things. And so we have a number of these books, starting with Irenaeus around the year 180, a 5-volume work against Gnostics, for example. And so they were dead set against these people. There was actually more vitriol against these other groups that called themselves Christian, than there were against Jews at the period, and that there were against pagans.
How popular were these other groups, and did their popularity feed into the vitriol that the Proto-orthodox used when they attacked them?
I think it had to, because otherwise there's no reason for the vitriol. I mean, if this is just simply some crazy person off in the wilderness someplace saying something, he's got a few followers, well, okay. But if he's attracting a number of people from your congregation, and what he's saying makes a lot of sense to them, then you've got to show why he's not only wrong, but he's evil. And they do that. And so some of the church fathers, like Irenaeus early on, who's writing around 180 or 185 or so about a century after our Gospels, he is really terrified by the fact that these Gnostics have infiltrated his kind of church, and they're kind of siphoning off people into their version. And he says it's really hard to recognize these people. They don't dress differently or anything. So it was a big issue. And they talk about how large some of these churches were and how dangerous the movements were.
What were some of the things that the Proto-orthodox groups used to attack these other Christian groups? Did they spread rumors about them? Are they kind of just overblowing some of the stranger things about their practices and their beliefs? What were they doing?
Yes and yes. There's no evidence of physical violence. It's not like they're like murdering these people or anything, or martyring them. It's all verbal abuse, so far as we can tell. The verbal abuse involves sometimes summarizing what the opponents say, and then mocking it. Or showing how ridiculous it is, showing how contradictory it is, how it makes no sense, how it's contrary to what Jesus taught, how it's how it's inspired by the devil. And so it's a lot of verbal vitriol that involves sometimes distorting positions. We know that they sometimes distorted positions because since they wrote in the modern period, we've actually found writings by some of these groups, and we can see what they actually did say. And sometimes they're being completely misrepresented, and it's both that they're illogical and they're contradictory and they're non-commonsensical, but also that believing these things lead to rampant immorality. And so some of especially the Gnostic groups, are being charged with absolutely crazy, bizarre, and obscene kind of practices that they do, that sometimes with voyeuristic pleasure they kind of detail. Tertullian people, Epiphanius later, they go into really graphic detail about what's happening in these worship services to scare people off.
If the majority of people at the time were not literate, which I think is the case, how did these writings from Proto-orthodox writers kind of get disseminated? Do we have any idea how effective they were at actually removing people from these heretical congregations?
So the way these writings got circulated is the way that all writings did in the ancient world, including the books of the New Testament, where, in a world where the vast majority of people could not read. I mean, in some rural areas, like 98% of the people can't read, but it means if you got 100 people there, 2 people could read. Or if you're in a city where, 10 or 15% of the people could read, well, okay, you'll have people in your community could read. And so for most people in the ancient world, reading a book meant hearing it read. So public reading, not necessarily out on the public square, but like in a home or in some kind of church setting or synagogue, things were read out loud, and that's how people heard things. And so these books of these heresiologists, these studiers of heresy, these heresy hunters, would have been read to the churches. We know how effective they were over the long term because they eventually quashed the opposition. And so they clearly were effective. How effective they were kind of on a local level, individually at the time, we don't have any way of gauging.
Now, you mentioned a little bit earlier in our conversation that these groups were using a lot of the same religious texts that we see today, that the Proto-orthodox groups also were using. Did any of them have specific texts that were just for that group?
Well, they had both. So they had specific ways of interpreting texts, and they had their own specific texts. And so, on the first thing, the thing you first mentioned, they had Gnostic groups, for example, various groups of Gnostics who emphasized the importance of knowledge for salvation and believed that Jesus revealed the secret knowledge. They had no trouble using books, the Gospels of the New Testament, for example, because they had their own kind of secret interpretations of those books. And part of that was a battle then over who has the right interpretation of what these books are actually saying. But in addition to that, they had their own writings that supported their views. And we found a number of these in modern times, especially among the Gnostics. Most recently, for example, the Gospel of Judas Iscariot turned up about 20 years ago. And we have a Gospel of Mary, and we have various Gospels. Some people will have heard of the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Philip. A lot of these are books that are not Orthodox, that were being read, that were being subscribed to by people who thought these are written by apostles and they're conveying the truth. And these proto-orthodox over here, who are complete literalists, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't have the knowledge that we have.
Could you give an example of how maybe a Marcionite, a Proto-orthodox Christian, and a Gnostic might have understood the same text differently?
Well, so if you just taking like a big text, the Old Testament, like considering that as a text, the Marcionites would point out how wrathful and ruthless the God of the Old Testament is, and that he's not evil, but he's given a law. The law to the Jews. Nobody can possibly keep that law. And so he punishes them ruthlessly. And that's not the same God who speaks through Jesus, who says, love your enemies and turn the other cheek and pray for those who persecute you. No, this God is a hateful God. And so they're two different gods. So that's the Marcionite view. The Gnostic view tended to be that it's not that there's only one other God. There are lots of other gods, and the God of the Old Testament is one of them. But it's not so much that he's wrathful as that he is ignorant and or evil, depending on which Gnostic group you talk to, and that he's created this world to be a place of misery and suffering. I mean, look around. There's so much misery and suffering. A good God didn't create this. It's a lower form of divinity who did. And the goal of this religion is to get you out of the grasp of that God by removing yourself from this material world that he created. But the Old Testament is valuable because the true God reveals truth in there in mysterious ways. And so whereas Marcion rejected the Old Testament as saying, no, this is not a Christian book. This is a Jewish book. We have our scriptures. Gnostics would say, oh yeah, no, the Old Testament. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there, especially in Genesis. They say symbolic interpretations of it. The Proto-orthodox group said no to both of these. They said yes to Marcion. This is a Christian book, and that God is just, but he's also loving, and the plan of salvation was for these things to happen so that God could send the Savior later. But there's absolute continuity between the God who created the world and Christ, his son. And against the Gnostics, they'd say, look, you have your interpretations, you're calling them secret knowledge, they're just weird, and they're wild, and they're crazy, and we can show that they're crazy. And so it's a very different thing among the three of them.
Thank you. Do you think that the canonization of the New Testament was somehow a response to the texts, or some of the texts that you were mentioning earlier, the things like the Gospel of Judas and the Gospel of Mary, the Proto-orthodox trying to kind of draw a line around what was accepted scripture and what was absolutely not?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, just to take the Gospels, for example, Um, the The reality is that the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when they were first written, they didn't have names attached to them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when they're early quoted, nobody calls them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Nobody calls them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for almost 100 years. And it's about in the 180s at the time that Irenaeus is writing to opposing the heretics. And he, as it turns out, is the first to call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why is he doing that? Well, because he knows that these other groups have books that they claim are written by apostles. You've got gospels allegedly written by Philip and by Thomas and by James. And by, kind of go down the list. They have all these gospels that they say authorize them because they're written by apostles. And Irenaeus says, yeah, no, those were not written by apostles. These are, and they're Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so if you want an authoritative text, you've got to name it, right? It's got to have an author attached to it to have the authority. And so I think the entire collection of the New Testament in many ways is driven by the fact that the Proto-orthodox group wanted to insist that we've got the authoritative text. These are the only authoritative texts. Your texts are forged. They're fake. Ours are authentic. And this is how we have to decide what to believe based on these texts only.
Do you have a favorite heretical text or belief?
Oh boy, I got lots. Well, I really like the Gospel of Thomas. I'm maybe because I'm teaching it tomorrow morning. my undergraduate class. It's on my mind just now. 114 sayings of Jesus, about half of which are very similar or are almost identical to what you have in Matthew and Luke, but others that are very bizarre. I think you and I have had a podcast on this. I think Mark Goodacre's done a podcast on this with us, and it's a terrific text, very interesting and very old. It probably is our oldest surviving non-canonical gospel, and so and is a big debate about it. When it was discovered with a group of other Gnostic writings, it was declared to be a Gnostic gospel. And then later, about 20 years ago, people started saying, yeah, actually, there's not much Gnostic about this. Maybe it's not a Gnostic gospel. And there are debates about it. I still consider it to be a book that was used by Gnostics and probably was influenced by a Gnostic point of view. But what's really interesting when you dig down into the weeds and start looking at some of the sayings, they're really quite remarkable.
I'm sure you're going to be getting into those in your course, so I'm not going to dive too deep into
indeed.
that particular question. Damn it, I had a question in my brain and now it's just flown away.
But let me say something about that, which is that in this course, the way I'm setting it up is I've got 8 lectures, and the way it's going to be is I'm going to describe like where a group came from, what their beliefs were, what they said, but then another lecture is going to be on the texts that they used. What gospels did they use, or what other writings did they use, and what can we say about these? And so it'll be both kind of their ideas and their texts, and I think that's going to be a lot of fun.
Why do you think people should take this course?
People today recognize that Christianity is a pretty diverse thing. I mean, Roman Catholics are not the same as the Southern Baptists, and the Greek Orthodox are not the same as the Appalachian snake handlers, and they're all calling themselves Christian. And people tend to think, though, that that's a modern phenomenon. And the reality is that in the early centuries of Christianity, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, things were so much more diverse, even than all that. And people don't seem to know that much about it. People do know that there are other gospels written, and sometimes people are interested in these other books and things, but they don't know much about them, and they don't know about these other groups. And so this will be a chance just to have a really kind of solid and interesting summary of what these groups were and what scriptures they used. And that helps to contextualize what Christianity itself ended up becoming, in opposition to these various groups, how we got Christianity as we know it today.
Thank you. I have one more question and then we will let you go for the rest of the day. What kind of threads do you see in modern Christianity that may not be able to be traced back to these ancient heresies, but have something in common with them?
So I'll just give you one example. I think that, Marcion, whom I've mentioned, thought that the Old Testament, the God of wrath, wasn't the God you wanted to worship. And so he didn't accept the Old Testament. And he thought that the creation was by that other God. And so because of that, he thought Jesus could not belong to the creation. So Jesus could not really be a material being because the material world was created by the Old Testament God. So Jesus had to come only seeming to be human. He appeared to be human. And that was a very common thought among some parts of Christianity, that Jesus seemed to be a human, but he wasn't really human. And I've noticed that a lot of my undergraduate students, who've grown up, many of them have grown up in conservative churches, have the idea that the Old Testament God really isn't the God of Jesus. I mean, we've kind of moved beyond the Old Testament God. And when you kind of push them a little bit, they'll say, yeah, Jesus was human and divine. But when you really push them, they think he was divine. They're not comfortable with Jesus like doing things that most humans do, like making mistakes or having bodily functions, or like, getting something wrong or anything like that. It's like, no, he wouldn't do that. They would probably say that if you asked him, they'd say, yeah, well, he could have spoken Swahili when he was 2. Of course, he was God. And so, it's a reflection of the view that Marcion had. I mean, they would say, well, Marcion took it to an extreme, but in some ways, it's not really taking seriously the humanity of Jesus or the continuity of the God of Jesus with the God of the Old Testament. And so I think there are reflections, actually, of a number of these heretical groups today.
But thank you so very much. I am going to be moderating the live recording of this, so I am very much looking forward to listening and learning a lot more about early Christian heresies. And if anyone watching is interested in taking the course, there will be details in the video description below. Thank you again, Bart. I'll see you soon.
Okay, thank you. All right.